In terms of science, anarcho-capitalism, I think, in like hardcore libertarianism, it has an interesting relationship with science.
Okay.
In terms of a political philosophy, right? Because the left is, as far as I can tell, is informed philosophically from consequentialism based off of their subjective values in terms of understanding harm reduction, right? And so when the science seems to support ideas that lead to their notion of harm reduction, they love it. And when the science doesn't support those things, they reject it. On the right, what it seems like you have is the right loves science so long as it doesn't interact or contradict their values, whatever their values are.
Yeah.
Right. If the science says, for example, if there was a large study to come out tomorrow, right, that said that actually OnlyFans girls are happier and healthier than the average girl their age, right? No matter how many times I was peer reviewed, no matter how much science was backing that up, no matter different, studies, attacking it, trying to isolate for different variables, age groups, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, culture, whatever, the right would just deny it, right? They would just deny it because it clashes with one of their values.
Okay.
And what I think the biggest fault of science in general is that science has completely lost, well, at least its communication to the public has completely lost its Enlightenment philosophy, which I think is imperative to being able to understand science. So what we have now is we have a large group of the population that reads a title, reads an abstract, and thinks, this backs up what it is that I believe. How many citations does it have? If it has a large enough amount of citations, this is now what the science says, right? They don't understand methodology. They don't understand empiricism. They don't understand that there's no idea of like inductive and deductive reasoning and how one, attempts to approach the truth. Like you also have so many soft sciences like psychology, sociology, economics, and things that cannot be done in a laboratory environment and cannot isolate for variables. And yet they make the same level of scientific claims as, let's say, a chemist.
Yeah.
And so it's just so muddied, I think, mostly by bad philosophy. I think libertarians have a good philosophy, but that we're a much, much smaller minority of people. And I think we're far more focused on rights violations, philosophically. And we can kind of give a rat's ass what the science says. If the science goes because if the science suggests in some way that it is that it would be better consequentially to violate rights in some capacity, we will just tell those scientists to go fuck off. So I think that's kind of like there seems to be a problem from every political sphere in being able to understand science. And the way that I see it is the philosophy is no longer there. And so it's just publishing of results in a system that's meant to be skeptical. It's insane. Like, how the hell do you communicate that?
Yeah, man, that's a good point. I mean, I try to surround myself in people that are kind of skeptical of science and stuff to try to better understand that. Like I exist in online, a lot of anti-vax communities and stuff where I try to answer science questions and stuff like that. And, that's one of the biggest things that I always say is scientists are skeptical inherently, because especially when, 99% of research science fails, you're going to be very skeptical, actually, even of the positive result. You're going to be like, what's going on here? This isn't right. There's no way. And, there's a lot of failing. And, I think that's actually the crazy thing when you actually get a positive result. You're like, this is nuts. This can't be real. And then you reproduce it. You're like, what? Like, no way. This is crazy, And that's kind of where, that's where, the bigger ideas kind of build upon themselves and how we've gotten to these, areas where, with COVID and, the lipid nanoparticles and stuff like that. I mean, I work in a nanotechnology lab, and that's old stuff, man. That's like 30 years old, actually. We're working with single-walled carbon nanotubes. We're doing coatings for it with them. We're doing quantum dots, carbon dots, really next level
Those sound
stuff.
like words. Those sound like words.
So
that's what they sound like to
carbon
me.
and quantum dots are things that are basically on the sides of like proteins. I mean, actually, the single volt carbon nanotubes that I work with are actually the exact same size as like the tobacco mosaic virus. And that tobacco mosaic virus is just like RNA that's been, in a spiral, and we're doing complex things now that are really unbelievable in nanotechnology. Like, for example, David Liu's lab out of Broad Institute in Harvard, they're actually adorning things onto viruses now. I'm sorry, adorning things onto nanoparticles that make them look like viruses so that they can go into specific cells and then deliver like molecular biology tools like CRISPR, and then turning on and actually curing genetic blindness in mice. So we've actually done this. Virus-like particles.
It's fucking terrifying.
Isn't that
like
amazing?
there's a small bit of like the Luddite in me that's just like, can we not fuck with this? Like I recognize the utility and the amazing ingenuity of it. But also the social, it's kind of like AI, where it's like, you hear things like that and you're like, cool, but like, is any non-scientist like wackos that aren't just excited for that positive result, like over their shoulder, like, hey, be careful with this. You know what I mean?
It's a big thing right now. Like,
it's honestly, pretty regulated.
It's a big thing right now to talk about ethics at conferences. Normally, 10 years ago, conferences, you'd have like the ethics be kind of like the last day, the last presentation, and nobody's kind of going to it. Everyone's kind of like leaving beforehand. Now they're kind of like, in the day, they kind of have like presentation ethics kind of thing. And it's really popular ever since CRISPR was discovered and is used and is so widespread now. I mean, thousands of companies are using CRISPR, and in even more research labs. It's kind of like the standard tool of molecular biology to change DNA. So there's a huge discussion on making sure that CRISPR is more specific, that there's no off-target effects. If there is any off-target effects, that we can usually easily detect them. Actually, David Liu, same guy, it's one of my favorite labs, I'll be honest. They're actually creating a new CRISPR that actually inactivates itself once it's done the cut, so that it can't actually continue to make off-target effects and stuff. So there's I just, more to your point, I think that there, like basically there's what the public knows, and then there's kind of like the undergrad kind of like level, but then there's like research science, and it's like, it just keeps growing, and the gap keeps growing, and there's huge ramifications in our society because of that. You can see it with COVID, misinformation about vaccines. You can see it,
I'm willing to bet we won't agree on a lot of the misinformation, but I'm sure we will on some.
Okay.
I was pretty I've been pretty anti-COVID vaccine.
Okay.
Since it came out, and still am.
Okay. Why is that?
And I'm also against the rotavirus, for the record. Fuck the rotavirus vaccine if you live in a first world country. Dr. Paul Offit can go suck my dick on that one. Like, you can give your kids saline.
Okay. Well, what's your views on the vaccine then?
My biggest fears in the vaccine, right? Luckily, it doesn't seem that it panned out with all of the different iterations, right? But, we're given a vaccine, which, we can have a laughable debate about whether or not it's a vaccine as opposed to like a therapeutic, because of the viral load in the upper respiratory tract. In fact, it's not like a sterilizing vaccine. And that was kind of always my biggest concern, is the fact that it's not a sterilizing vaccine. Luckily, we didn't have antibody dependent enhancement, but like, I think that was a legitimate, pretty big concern for me, was that you have a vaccine that reduces symptomology, but doesn't actually reduce the infection rate. And if you're not reducing the infection rate and people are asymptomatic walking around, and you only have one portion of the virus's structure, from the alpha variant, obviously we have like the new BA.5 vaccines coming out. I don't know. Is it out yet? I can't remember if it's
out.
It should be. Is it out like officially? Okay. Like, I know like a week or two ago they were talking about it. But like, obviously, there is some catch up with that. But my biggest concern and my biggest reasoning there is, we could get into, the failures of the FDA throughout all of history. We could get into the fact that one of the labs was cooking cooking their numbers when investigated by the FDA at Pfizer. But I mean, I think what Pfizer produced is relatively similar to what Moderna and J&J and the other mRNA therapies are. So like, I don't know that's the biggest deal. I think it shows the failure of the FDA, but not necessarily of the vaccine itself. But yeah, like I think if I'm not, and also I have an enlarged aortic valve, right?
Okay.
So like if I get fucking, myocarditis or pericarditis, like I'm fucking dead. Okay. Right. So obviously as someone under 35, like it's a contraindication for me to take it anyways. But yeah, like my biggest concern is that if you're not actually reducing the infection rate, right? And instead you're reducing symptomology and allowing people and restricting people and forcing it on people. There's a lot of social and political things that are just immediately rights violations. But from the vaccine itself, that's kind of my primary concern is that, we don't know the long-term effects, but that's kind of true of any medication. So you hear people, well, we don't know the long-term effects. It's like, dog, that's every medication that comes out.
Yeah.
Right.
If you want to see 30 years of data, you got to wait 30 years. So
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. But if I was given a vaccine that, was kind of proven to have a I think this vaccine does have a statistically significant, is last time I checked in terms of reducing the infection for the individual. But the problem is that if an individual is asymptomatic and they have the same kind of viral load in the upper respiratory tract, they're more likely to go out, not get tested and spread the virus. So it doesn't seem to really reduce the spread of the virus. And yeah, I'm always concerned about ADE. Like I said, luckily Delta came out, which was less deadly. Omicron came out, which is less deadly. BA5 came out, which is less deadly, which is kind of the typical track of viruses, regardless of interventions, right? And same thing happened with Spanish flu. That's a virus doesn't do well if it kills its host and isn't infectious, right? And so viruses tend to evolutionarily, but new variants come out and they tend towards the direction of being less deadly and more infectious.
In general, I mean, there is like the evolutionary push is to infect the next person. The virus doesn't care if it kills you afterwards. That's doesn't care. I mean,
but if it kills you too quickly or if it's too deadly, right?
If you don't infect anyone, then it's not going to be able to evolve.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's the evolutionary trap that it has. And that's why like RNA viruses and stuff, they'll have high mutation rates, but to a point, right? If they mutate too quickly and too large, like they can swap, their genomes around inside of you and stuff like that, then they're not able to latch on to the ACE2, which is what the SARS-CoV-2 latches onto. Then it either needs to find another, it needs to find another binding protein that it can bind to, or it dies. I guess there's like two different things that we're talking about, and this is kind of like the problem that I run into a lot is like the oversimplification of science and stuff. And I try not to do that. I try to talk to people like they're adults, and but there's two different things that we're talking about.
Fine.
SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. So SARS-CoV-2 is the virus, and COVID-19 is the thing that the virus causes. And SARS-CoV-2 is going to spread to you, and it can be present, so you could be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, and it has to do with kind of like the curve, the growth curve.
Yeah, it takes like 3 to 4 days. Right. Yeah. It takes, I think, 3 to 4 days before you reach like the kind of the average peak of symptomology. And then you kind of get like a slower down.
But sometimes you don't get symptoms. You don't get COVID symptoms, right? You're not going to you could get symptoms of just like having like a virus in you, but then you might not develop some of the COVID symptoms, or it could be too early and you're going to develop COVID symptoms later. So
all that's true.
So it's hard. And there is, so I believe that that basically you have like there's different stages of your immune system. Honestly, I don't work with humans. Humans are actually really boring scientifically for me, but this is, you have stages of your immune system, and basically you have kind of like the basal, like the bacteria and viruses that are kind of like already living on you that are going to be kind of like the first stage. And then you have, your B cells and T cells that need to be activated in order to make antibodies and to all that kind of stuff. That's kind of like the second big wave. So it's kind of hard unless you have the antibodies already in you and already going, then it's hard for it to stop the virus. Thankfully, a lot of these the vaccines, they do have kind of like a latent antibody that stays in your bloodstream for about 6 months. That's like the where it starts to really dive off. And there's conflicting evidence basically whether or not those antibodies in your body are going to decrease your viral load. I think that does. I think there's better evidence to say that it decreases the viral load within you. There's been a couple of papers that have said that they don't, but they use a type of molecular technique like qPCR, and they don't do the necessary work in order to figure out that. Basically, in order to know whether or not the amount of viral load that's in there, you have to do a serial dilution. So you have to dilute the amount that you have, and then you have to dilute it again. So, and then you basically correlate those numbers, and you get an R squared to see if that it actually dilutes. They didn't do that. They didn't do that work.
I'm not a hardcore scientist, right? Like, I do my best as someone that is in the political sphere to talk about things that are politically relevant. So I do the best to educate myself in those regards. The issue is, I think the real issue in terms of the vaccine, right? As far as I can tell, is kind of what I've already stated, right? Is that it's obviously not a sterilizing vaccine. It just isn't, right? Like people are getting sick all the time with the vaccine. At a rate that is like not common with, let's say, a polio vaccine, or like, if you were inoculated against smallpox or something else, right? But the other issue is that there's three people working together here, right? And what you have is the super nerdy scientist types, right? The virologists and the researchers and manufacturers of the therapeutics, right? Then you have the epidemiologists, and then you have the state, the government, right? And there's a massive disconnect between these three people. Okay. Because I think the people working on these therapeutics and things like that, while I think they're obviously biased in favor of their own therapeutics, they tend to be fairly honest, right? And when you look into the research, some of the things that they say, I think are, they've changed some of the wording in the papers that they use, right? Like efficacy, all of a sudden, had to do with symptomology. And then they kind of wouldn't state that. They'd kind of bury that somewhere in the results. So you had to like read the entire paper to recognize that they were measuring efficacy, not by like, infection rate or viral load or anything like that, but in terms of symptomology. Things that were obviously done to get other people to want to publish or want to, put forward their research, which is, just kind of the incentive structure. You want to write something good, and there's politics involved. And once politics are involved, some of the ethics, I think, start to go a little bit to the wayside. Not terribly from them, though, right? But in terms of the epidemiologists, there is so much junk science that was touted by governments and media organizations, such as like kids wearing masks in schools, right? Like these were things that were like not even real science at all, right? Like there was no, there was no comparisons, there was no control groups, there was no like, many of them were just like models. They weren't even like actual studies. Like it was horrible, right? And then you had the government that, took what should be, they felt, to be as charitable as I can because I'm an anarchist, right? But to be as charitable as I can, they felt an impetus, the World Health Organization, the EU, different governments, they felt an impetus to do something and to get people to take the vaccine and to get people to comply with, government mandated like lockdowns or, all of the different things that they were doing to stop the spread of the virus, right? And so what they did is they very clearly highlighted science articles that supported them And they very clearly diminished, deplatformed. The American government used its own policymakers to put pressure on, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter from like Dr. Malone, people that are skeptical and people that you can say, I think they're wrong or I think their science is bad, but attempted to do everything they could to silence any dissent. And when you have that combination of like junk science from epidemiologists and from people that weren't even fucking like some random cancer researcher, and now NBC is touting it, and the panic and the government's ability to kind of pick and choose what it wanted to believe and then contradicting itself instead of just being honest and be like, hey, we don't know. This is what the science seems to suggest at the moment. All of those things together, of course you have massive skepticism. And we see today that there's still not appropriate studies on pregnant women, despite the fact that the CDC is still saying pregnant women should get the vaccine. We see a silencing of opinion of, let's say, the Moderna, right? Or was it Johnson & Johnson? I think it's Moderna, right? Men under the age of 30 that have much higher rates of pericarditis and pericarditis and myocarditis from the vaccine than from infection. You see this still to this day. You see the CDC comparing unlike variables and publishing that as like it's science, where like they're comparing all of the records of vaccinated people versus only the records of people that go to the hospital that are unvaccinated, right? You're seeing terrible science promulgated by the government in favor of corporations that have a monopoly from the state to get money. And then you're like, well, why is their vaccine? Like, why are people not getting this vaccine? It's like, how could you'd have to be a fucking idiot, or you'd have to be a scientist that really knows their shit. Like, those are the only two people, right? That would be willing to just take the government's word at face value and trust this vaccine at this point.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the CDC, does itself no favors when they use things like, preprints on a lot of their advisory stuff. I have a big problem with that. I mean, I think that the peer review process is probably the most important part of the process of, of science, no pun intended with my channel name, but it's like, it's really where you kind of like open up your science and let it be seen and stuff like that. And there is, like, science isn't funded to the point where like people have tons of money to just do extraneous experiments. So you do have, like a lot of companies that go to labs, the top labs, and they're like, we need to have this studied. We're going to give you money to do this independent of it. And they do it, so that those science labs do that. And also government money, right? The government has an interest in what it is that they want researched. Yeah, they have the NIH funds it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then also I think it's important to point out one of the biggest failures, I think, of science in general is it's a lot easier to get funding to try and prove something than it is to try and falsify something. It's difficult to get funding for research for peer review more so than it was 20 or 30 years ago, because it's not interesting to the people. They want you to prove something. They want you to establish something. They don't want you to study something that's already been studied in an attempt to falsify it. It's just, it's harder to get those grants. And so I think the scientific process and the peer review process has been weakened over time because of the kind of the psychological incentive for like new research as opposed to, making sure the research we have is good research.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is if you falsify something, like, then what's happening? You have to study that mechanism, and that's what you're publishing. That if you can do that, you can't. It's just like you have to explain, like, okay, so if that's not happening, what's your hypothesis for why it is happening? And that's kind of like the positive step forward that happens.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's getting a little harder. I think the peer review process isn't quite as strong as it used to be.
I don't know if it's changed all that much. I mean, you have basically these journals being the gatekeepers, and it is kind of weird. There's only 3, peer reviewers that actually go through, and I think that I mean, personally, I think it should be kind of opened up. I think it should be. I like the idea of I like the idea of preprints. I like the idea of you staking your claim to the evidence and then allowing public comment on that, and allowing kind of like more of a democratic process to be going through. These 3 people aren't the arbiters for their entire field, and they get things wrong. They actually try to sneak in their own papers. That's like, you always get a reviewer that's like oh, you've completely missed this huge foundational step forward in this
Right.
field, and just link.
You know
this
what my favorite
guy's
one is?
Roberts et al. And you're like, oh, you're Roberts. That's why you say this.
Yeah. My favorite one though is when you go to peer review and then they're like, oh, you missed this paper, you need to do better, and it's the author of the paper.
Exactly.
And it's like, you mean my own fucking research, dog?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
I love when that happens, when people like forget to cite themselves and then they're like, you didn't do this, it needs to be fixed. And it's like, dog, that's me. Like, I'm not plagiarizing me. Like,
Yeah. The double blind thing, the double blind peer review is kind of weird. I think that the peer reviewers should be published as well. I mean, if you got to have more transparency than less in science, I'm pretty much always advocate for that. But I think Malone and it's an interesting case of someone that's unfortunately grifting. Because of the pandemic, there's a lot of people that kind of were not associated with science, or they've been associated with the science far long ago. And, his paper in 1989 on the GFP delivery for, lipid nanoparticles was good. It was good work. And in 1989, it's still strong during that era, but delivering GFP, which is a fluorescent protein, is going to be a lot different than an RNA vaccine. And there's a lot of work that had to be done between his delivery of GFP and what happened, the vaccine that we have now. There's a lot of flanking regions that had to be added. You have to stabilize the RNA through some molecular motifs, it's called, and so there's been a lot of development since that, and I feel like since Malone, since that time, he kind of got out of science. He was in the kind of the consulting realm. He was in kind of like this weird space where his science wasn't really going forward, and then in my opinion, he's kind of capitalizing on this opportunity because Malone is vaccinated. You know that, right? Like he admits that he is vaccinated. So,
right.
By the way, I don't like the vaccine. Just to talk about your Liberty claims real quick. I don't advocate for everyone to be vaccinated. It's a thing that you have to talk to your doctor about. I think that vaccines are safe and effective. Personally, I vaccinate myself. I get a booster every 6 months. My family does. We vaccinated our children. But that.
Oof.
Yeah.
Why would you vaccinate your kids, dude?
Oh yeah,
why would you do that?
Because long COVID has a lot of interesting. Interesting, but
children.
Oh yeah, we have no idea.
Dude, if you're under the age, if you're under the age of 24, you're more likely to die from a Tylenol overdose than you are from COVID. Like long COVID symptoms in children are incredibly rare.
Well, it's actually a lot more prevalent than we're thinking now. A lot of the new studies that are showing that long COVID symptoms are actually very prevalent. So, in a developing brain like that, I'm not going to, test that. I'd rather have them. And on top of that,
I'm not going to test my kids on that. Yeah, fuck that, dude. That
it's my parents.
Sorry, I have a legitimate emotional reaction to that.
Okay.
I'm a father as well, and that. I just couldn't imagine doing something like that to my children.
It's the them being around their grandparents, them me not wanting to lose my parents out of COVID. It's us having it. I'm at the university with a lot of undergrads, so I'd rather have them be vaccinated.
Wait, you said at a university with a lot of undergrads? How old are your kids?
No, me. I'm teaching, so I.
Oh, you just mean you're worried about catching it? Yeah.
Yeah. I could be an asymptomatic carrier, or a pre-symptomatic carrier.
Yeah, my kids had Delta and Omicron. They're strong.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah. Fuck that.
And
fuck that, dude.
I did
no.
just. I.
No, I'm not risking the fucking the unknown and obviously underreported vaccine injuries on my kids for something that is way I just no, I just can't imagine that. That seems if you're 40 years old, I get it. But oh man, sorry, that fucked me up, dude.
Do you get them vaccinated for other things?
Yeah.
Why?
What do you mean why? Because told you the two vaccines that I don't support as of yet.
Okay.
The COVID vaccine and rotavirus, right? Okay. Because I don't think there's anything necessary to the rotavirus vaccination. I think the main reason that it's on the vaccine schedule is because Dr. Paul Offit sits on the fucking council and owns patents on the shit. And it's just not like it matters if you don't have access to clean drinking water, right? Like if you're in a third world country, rotavirus is a big issue. But if you get rotavirus, you get diarrhea. And if you get it really bad, you might have to give them saline. It just doesn't seem worth it.
So why do you think that the polio vaccine is so effective versus the COVID vaccine?
Like, you want me to explain deep science, like at a molecular level that I don't understand?
Well, no, sorry.
You know what I mean?
I didn't mean to, I'm just like the sterilization, you were talking about sterilization before, and I'm just like curious, like, why do you think that those vaccines are so effective versus the COVID vaccine that you...
Well, I mean, like, obviously there's different levels depending upon the vaccine of like your likelihood of catching it regardless of being vaccinated, right? Like MMRV, for example, is really good and strong, right? Like you get an MMRV vaccine, you're not getting chickenpox for 20 years. I mean, technically it's possible, but you're not getting it. Other, things like, a smallpox vaccine, which we're obviously not really doing unless you deploy or something. You know what I mean? Also really good, right? Like it's a live attenuated virus. Like it's not a big deal, right? As long as you take care of it and clean the wound, you know what I mean? Like you're pretty much not getting, because you're getting infected with smallpox, right? Like it's gonna fucking work, right? But yeah, like there are other vaccines that, aren't as good and depend upon herd immunity. Like I recognize that.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's because they're not in active pandemic, right? They're not mutating constantly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And also you don't have 70 fucking exposures when you go to the grocery store, like you might with COVID. Right.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, that's obviously a very different situation, right? In terms of that. So I do think whether or not you get vaccinated is depending on the virus also depends upon like what's occurring in your location in that specific time, right?
Yeah.
Like if you were in Japan in the 1980s, right, getting an MMR vaccine was probably a really good idea, right? Because was it mumps that was going around? I don't remember which of the three was going around because of the whole like thimerosal situation. Japan was like no longer mandating that people get MMR vaccines, and then they had an outbreak that was like really bad, right? Like worse than like the Oregon moms type shit, but like really bad. So, I mean, like, I do think that like what's going on in the time and can change whether or not you want to get vaccinated for something. But yeah, like when we look at the polio vaccine and we look at, how many cases of documented vaccine injuries do we have? And then we compare that to the COVID vaccine. What we have is really good data on polio that says that it's really unlikely that you're going to have any reaction despite like maybe like being tired for a few days or something like that, right? And then what we have with the COVID vaccine is conflicting and massive amounts of conflicting data. Like we just don't fucking know. We have no idea what the pericarditis, myocarditis rates are. We have we have no idea where these excess deaths are coming from, whether that's from COVID and they're not being counted by COVID, or whether or not those are vaccine injuries. We have politics that have involved that have been deeply infected into both the scientific community, but also in terms of the government. We just don't know. And then also we have like if we look at like VAERS reporting, right? VAERS is reporting like something like 30,000, like really bad, reports as compared to like every other year. It's like 400 at most. Right. But the issue with that is like how many of those are fraudulent? And then we also know that VAERS tends to underreport even in deaths. Right. And then we also have, tons of reports of people that are for political reasons not reporting. And then for other political reasons might be more likely to report, right? Because they're worried about the hospital getting sued or something. So they definitely want to make sure they report. And then in other places, they're like, what? No, that couldn't possibly be the vaccine when he died 2 days after getting the vaccine and he was a perfectly healthy 19-year-old, right? And so like we just don't have good data, but it seems that it, we just don't have good data. Like my intuition is that it's much, much, much higher, but it could be just the same as any other vaccine, right? And so, yeah, I'm not going to take that risk for something for children that, especially because by the time the vaccine rolled out, I think my kids had already had COVID once, right? They got like Delta, like right when Delta came out. If I'm like, or that like you couldn't get it for children, right? So they already had a level of natural immunity. So it would just be like even an extra level of absurdity to vaccinate them when they already have natural immunity and like they just released it. So like I want, especially before I give it to my own children, I want 10, 15 years of research, and I want completed clinical trials for all age categories, which we don't have. We have completed clinical trials for healthy people between the ages of like 25 and 45. That's what we have clinical trials on. And we don't even have good clinical trials because those people then got fucking vaccinated later. So like we can't even compare them long term. They poison their own clinical trials. So we don't have any good clinical trials for any of these vaccines.
Yeah, it's kind of like an ethical thing where you can't really give someone a placebo when it's during an active pandemic and they think that they're vaccinated, or when they're not.
I'm not saying I blame them, you know what I mean? But I do say that it poisons the well on having a good set of data. And they didn't like the original, the later ones are better, but the original ones that they did to get FDA emergency, authorization, they didn't even take a lot of blood work or like cholesterol levels, or like they did really shitty clinical trials.
Yeah, I'm not well.
Unless that data is not quite, unless that data hasn't come out yet, because they're coming out with data like, data dumps of like 100 and 150 pages at a time. Yeah. And it doesn't appear that data is in existence. It might be there. And Pfizer, of course, is, no comment as always.
I mean, so it's interesting that you bring up the myocarditis and the pericarditis, because that's actually from VAERS reports. So it's from people talking about that on VAERS, and then that's how they studied it. That's how it initially was found.
They did UK. Yeah, well, that's how it was initially found. I thought you meant like all the data was from that. I was like, no, we have like actual research. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it was that's where it spiked. So it's a good example actually of the VAERS system working in those, because you can't just take the amount of reports and the number of reports. You can download it yourself. There's a lot of and you look at studies that study that data.
Chat, hold on, pause. Yes, chat. This is supposed to be about climate change, but we got into shit. All right, it happens. This is what happens when you talk to smart people.
It's okay.
We can talk about the climate change here in a minute if you want.
Yeah. So our the data on the myocarditis and the pericarditis, you're right. With baseline, nothing, wild type human, taking a vaccine is going to be a little bit higher on the pericarditis. However, we have very good data to show that COVID-19, so getting SARS-CoV-2 and then establishing COVID-19 symptoms, if you get COVID-19, you have a much, much, much higher risk of myo and pericarditis than that. And then also it's really interesting.
But now you're taking the entire population, number one, and number two, you're taking if you get symptomatic COVID, right? And so the issue with that is that's not really comparing like variables there, right? And it's also not talking about the demographic that I mentioned, which was men under the age of 35, right?
Okay.
For men under the age of 35, there's been several research papers that have shown that especially with Moderna, but with all of the vaccines, that they're more likely to develop this than just catching COVID. But when you compare it to getting COVID and getting like long COVID, right? And you're talking about versus just people who are vaccinated, right? Even though we know that some vaccinated people also get long COVID, right? Like there's a lot of signifiers there to kind of justify the vaccine is like safe and effective, good and go ahead and get it. When I'm specifically talking about a specific population.
Okay.
Like if you're a 65-year-old woman, right? even though I'm pretty anti-vax for this, and I think a lot of the research is muddied, and I think that there's a lot of government influences that I don't like in this, and money that I don't like in this, I'd still say if you're a 65-year-old woman, I'd still be like, dude, go get the fucking vaccine, right? But if you're a healthy person that's not overweight and is getting sun, and you're, middle-aged or younger, I'm not a medical doctor. Talk to your fucking doctor, right? But, like for me, if I was in that category, that's a very different conversation.
Yeah. I personally, I love getting vaccines. I feel like a superhero afterwards. It feels awesome. So, but it's interesting you bring up the polio vaccine as an example of like a really good, well-working vaccine. The attenuated.
We're going to talk about the polio vaccine and all the horrors that came from that, or the Spanish flu vaccine, because there's been some hiccups. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people got polio from the polio vaccine because it went from a shot to an oral thing, and people actually got polio from it. So, I mean, basically how that works is like a live attenuated vaccine has basically been bred into like mammalian models, and it basically is infected and then taken out and infected into the other, and kind of like what you were talking about before, where if it mutates enough, it kind of like doesn't kill the host anymore, and then they take that mutated virus and then they give that to you. So the big benefit of this vaccine, of the RNA based vaccine, is that it doesn't have all those mutations anymore in it, and we have the exact same spike protein that is in SARS-CoV-2, and we know that that's well conserved in biology and molecular biology. Well conserved sequence is one that doesn't readily mutate because it needs to bind onto your ACE2 like receptor in order to get in.
Right. So, but that was always my concern going all the way back to ADE, right? Was just using the spike proteins, right? And, like look at Omicron. It was the spike proteins that changed the most in Omicron from Delta and the Alpha variant. And that's always been my fear with ADE. It looks like my original fears were unfounded. Or maybe not unfounded, but luckily didn't occur, I'll say.